You know what's strange? The people who truly see your value usually don't realize it while they still have easy access to you. That's the part nobody prepares you for. Not when you're the man who stayed calm during chaos. Not when you answered the late-night calls. Not when you kept swallowing your pride just to keep the connection alive a little longer. And I think, deep down, you already know exactly who I'm talking about. There's someone sitting in your mind right now, someone you pretend you're mostly over, but somehow they still appear in quiet moments. In the car, in the shower, at 2 a.m. when your phone lights up and for half a second your chest tightens before you even look. And what hurts isn't only missing them, it's the feeling that they never fully understood who you were while they had you. If this already feels uncomfortably personal, subscribe. Not because I need numbers, but because there are very few spaces where men are spoken to honestly about emotional attachment without being mocked for it. And I think part of you has been starving for that honesty. Because here's what I've noticed after years of listening to people talk about love, regret, distance, ego, silence. The person who can't stop crossing your mind is often wrestling with something too. Not always in the dramatic movie scene way people imagine. Not always crying on the floor or replaying your photos every night. Sometimes realization is quieter than that. Sometimes it enters their life slowly, through comparison. And comparison is brutal. At first, they thought your consistency was ordinary, your patience was ordinary, your emotional steadiness was ordinary, the way you listened, the way you remembered little details, the way you made them feel emotionally safe without announcing it every 5 minutes. Ordinary. Until they met people who weren't like that. That's usually when it starts. Not immediately, not all at once, just these small moments that sneak up on them. A conversation with someone new that feels strangely empty. A cold response where yours used to feel warm. A moment of vulnerability that gets mishandled, and suddenly, your absence develops a shape. That's the thing about emotional security. People rarely notice it while they're inside it. They only notice once it's gone. And if you're the kind of man who loved quietly, this becomes even more painful. Because quiet love is easy to underestimate. You probably didn't perform your feelings. You carried them. You showed up. You adjusted. You tolerated things longer than you should have because your attachment wasn't shallow. It was loyal. But loyal men often confuse endurance with invisibility. You start believing that because nobody praised what you gave, maybe it wasn't valuable. That's the lie. And I need you to hear me carefully here. A person failing to recognize your emotional value in real time does not mean it wasn't real. It usually means they were emotionally distracted, emotionally immature, emotionally overwhelmed, or simply too accustomed to receiving from you without imagining life without it. There's a difference. A very big difference. Because now they don't experience you directly anymore. Now they experience the space where you used to be. And space is loud, especially at night. Especially after ego settles down. Especially after attention from other people stops numbing everything. That's when memory becomes dangerous. Not fantasy, memory. The specific way you looked at them when they were upset. The way your voice changed when you knew something was wrong before they admitted it. The feeling that you actually saw them beneath whatever image they tried to maintain. People don't forget emotional safety easily. They forget excitement, they forget chemistry, they even forget attraction sometimes. But being deeply understood, that stays in the nervous system. And the strange part is, while you've been sitting there questioning your worth, wondering if you were forgettable, there's a very real chance the person you can't stop thinking about has only recently started understanding what it actually felt like to lose you. What makes this so difficult for you is that nobody sees the internal war. From the outside, you probably look functional. You go to work, you answer messages, you laugh at things you don't fully find funny anymore. Maybe you even convinced yourself you're fine. But emotionally, you keep revisiting invisible conversations. You replay moments trying to decode them differently, hoping there was some hidden clue that would make the ending hurt less. Your brain keeps asking questions your heart already knows the answer to. Did they ever really care? Was I too much? Did I make it too easy for them to leave? And the hardest one. If I mattered so much, why did they act like losing me was survivable? That question destroys a lot of men quietly, because men are often taught that their value is proven through usefulness, through performance, through being needed. So when someone walks away from your love, you don't just grieve the person, you question yourself. You start measuring your worth by their ability to stay. But human attachment is more complicated than that. People leave things they love all the time. Not because the love was fake, because timing was wrong, because fear was stronger, because they didn't know how to receive something healthy without sabotaging it, because familiarity with chaos can make peace feel emotionally unfamiliar. That last one matters more than most people realize. There are people who genuinely feel uncomfortable being loved consistently, not consciously, they won't say it out loud, but stability exposes unresolved parts of them. A calm, emotionally present man forces someone to confront themselves. There's nowhere to hide inside healthy connection, no games to distract from insecurity, no emotional turbulence to confuse with passion. And sometimes, that intimacy scares people more than loneliness does. You probably sense this without having language for it. There were moments where they leaned toward you emotionally, then suddenly pulled away after getting too close. Moments where they wanted reassurance but struggled to fully trust it once they received it. That inconsistency confused you because your feelings were direct. You loved in a linear way. They loved in waves. And men like you often blame yourselves for that. You think, maybe if I had been colder, maybe if I acted less available, maybe if I played games they would have valued me more. No, listen to me carefully. Temporary attention can be manipulated. Real emotional respect cannot. If someone only values you when you become distant, unavailable, or emotionally withholding, that isn't genuine recognition. That's anxiety reacting to loss of access. And honestly, you deserve deeper love than constantly having to disappear just to be noticed. But here's where things become psychologically complicated. Because sometimes the person is finally realizing your worth now that they no longer feel emotionally certain of you. Not because you became someone else, because your absence interrupted their emotional assumptions. See, when someone believes you'll always be there, they stop examining your value consciously. Human beings adapt quickly to emotional comfort. We normalize what consistently supports us, until it's removed. Then suddenly the mind starts reconstructing everything differently. And this process can take months. That's the part people don't tell you. Realization rarely happens during the breakup itself. During conflict, pride and emotional defensiveness are too loud. Everyone is focused on surviving their own emotions. But later? Later is dangerous. Later is when random memories attach themselves to ordinary moments. A certain song, a familiar street, the way another person says something almost like you, but not quite. And the nervous system notices the difference immediately. That's when people begin understanding emotional rarity. Not through logic, through contrast. You know something else men rarely admit? Part of you doesn't even want revenge. You just want acknowledgement, not applause, not begging. Just that quiet moment where the person finally understands. Oh, he loved me more sincerely than I realized. Because being misunderstood in love creates a very specific kind of grief. It makes you feel emotionally invisible. And invisible pain is dangerous because eventually you start treating yourself like you're easy to replace too. That's why I need you to stop interpreting someone's delayed realization as proof you were inadequate back then. Sometimes people only understand the emotional weight of a person after life forces comparison onto them. And comparison has a cruel way of revealing what comfort once concealed. There's another part of this that almost nobody talks about honestly. Sometimes the reason you can't stop thinking about them is because a part of you is still waiting to be chosen retroactively. Not just loved, chosen. There's a difference. You can survive someone loving you imperfectly. What breaks something inside you is feeling like they saw your heart clearly and still hesitated. Especially if you were the one who stayed emotionally exposed longer than they did. That creates a wound men carry in silence, because outwardly you'll say things like, "It is what it is." But internally, You're still standing in the emotional aftermath, wondering why your sincerity didn't feel convincing enough to them. And the mind does something dangerous after rejection that isn't fully resolved. It starts romanticizing emotional pain because pain at least preserves connection. That's why some nights you revisit memories you know will hurt you. Why you check old messages even when you shouldn't. Why your chest still tightens when their name appears unexpectedly. Your brain confuses emotional intensity with emotional importance. But those aren't always the same thing. Sometimes what you miss isn't only the person, it's the version of yourself that existed around them. The hopeful version, the emotionally open version, the man who still believed effort naturally led to closeness. After disappointment, men often become quieter emotionally, more controlled, more observant, less willing to risk humiliation. And honestly, I understand why. A lot of men have never been taught how to process emotional rejection without turning it into self-erasure. So instead, they adapt. They become emotionally strategic, less expressive, less trusting. Not because they stopped feeling deeply, because they learned how dangerous deep feeling can become when placed in uncertain hands. But here's the uncomfortable truth I think you already feel. Part of you still wants them to come back emotionally, not so you can restart the relationship exactly as it was, but so reality can finally match the value you know you carried all along. You want the confusion corrected. You want the emotional math to make sense. And if I'm honest with you, that desire is deeply human. We all want our pain to mean something. We all want to believe our love was visible. But closure rarely arrives in the cinematic way people imagine. Sometimes the realization happens entirely inside the other person, silently. No message, no dramatic confession, no midnight apology explaining every mistake perfectly. Just private recognition. And strangely enough, that can still change people permanently. Because once someone truly realizes your value, they can't fully unsee it anymore, even if life continues, even if distance remains, even if pride delays action. The nervous system remembers emotional safety with almost frightening accuracy. That's why people reconnect mentally with certain individuals years later. Not because they're bored, not because they couldn't do better, because emotional depth leaves fingerprints. And I think some part of you already sensed this. You've probably had moments where you suddenly felt them thinking about you again. A strange emotional pull out of nowhere. A dream. A memory that arrived too vividly. An unexplained heaviness late at night. Now, psychologically speaking, that doesn't mean there's some mystical bond controlling both of you. Human beings naturally revisit unresolved emotional attachments, especially ones connected to regret, comfort, or unfinished identity. But emotional connections do echo, especially the sincere ones. And sincere men underestimate their impact constantly. Because your love probably wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't built for social media performances or attention. It was subtle. The check-in texts, remembering details nobody else noticed, the restraint during arguments, the emotional protection you offered without needing credit for it. Quiet love feels small while it's happening, until it's gone. Then suddenly people realize how rare it was to feel emotionally considered instead of emotionally managed. And if the person you're thinking about is finally reaching that realization now, it's probably happening in moments you'll never see. That's the strange tragedy of emotional maturity. Sometimes people understand your value fully only after they no longer have uncomplicated access to you anymore. You know what changes a man the most? Not heartbreak itself, confusion. Heartbreak is painful, yes, but confusion is what lingers. Confusion is what keeps you awake, replaying details months later, trying to understand whether you imagined the entire connection. Because there were moments that felt real. You know there were. The way they looked at you when their guard accidentally dropped. The softness in certain conversations. The vulnerability they only showed when the world became too heavy for them to carry alone. People don't fake every emotional moment. That's important for you to understand. But they can genuinely feel something and still lack the emotional capacity to handle it correctly. That contradiction ruins people emotionally because the mind wants clean answers. Good person, bad person, real love, fake love. Reality is rarely that organized. Someone can care about you deeply and still hurt you repeatedly. Someone can miss you terribly and still not know how to reconnect in a healthy way. Someone can recognize your worth and still struggle with ego, fear, avoidance, or shame. Human beings are emotionally inconsistent creatures, and I think part of your exhaustion comes from trying to force emotional clarity onto something that was emotionally complicated from the beginning. You kept searching for certainty inside someone who was still uncertain within themselves. That's draining, especially for men who naturally move toward emotional responsibility. You probably became the stabilizer without realizing it, the one managing tension, the one trying to communicate carefully, the one carrying emotional weight silently because you thought love meant endurance. A lot of thoughtful men do this. They become emotionally strong for everyone else while quietly starving themselves of reassurance. And eventually something strange happens. You stop asking, "Do they love me?" and start asking, "Why do I feel alone inside this connection?" That's the moment relationships begin damaging self-worth. Because loneliness beside someone hurts differently than loneliness by yourself. At least alone, the emptiness makes sense. But feeling emotionally unseen while giving your full effort, that creates a kind of grief that slowly reshapes your personality. You become more guarded, more analytical, less spontaneous emotionally. Not because you lost your softness, because your softness stopped feeling safe. And the person you can't stop thinking about may only now be understanding the emotional cost of that. Not abstractly, specifically. They may finally realize how rare it was to be with someone who genuinely tried to understand them instead of simply reacting to them. That distinction matters. Most people listen just enough to respond. Very few listen to understand. And men who do that consistently, men who pay attention emotionally without making everything about themselves, they leave an imprint people tend to underestimate until much later. Especially in modern relationships where attention is easy to find but emotional safety is not. That's why someone can move on externally and still remain psychologically attached internally. Because attraction alone doesn't create emotional permanence. Recognition does. Being deeply understood does. Feeling emotionally protected without manipulation does. And once someone experiences that sincerely, superficial connections begin feeling strangely hollow afterward. Not always immediately. At first, distraction works, attention works, novelty works, ego works. But eventually life quiets down enough for emotional truth to surface. And emotional truth usually arrives softly, not with drama, just this growing awareness that something meaningful was mishandled. That's why people often return emotionally long after they convinced themselves they were finished. Not because they suddenly became weak, because unresolved appreciation has weight. And I know there's a part of you that still wonders whether they'll ever say it out loud, whether they'll ever admit they misjudged you, whether they'll ever fully understand how deeply you cared. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But what I don't want is for your entire healing process to become dependent on someone else finally becoming emotionally self-aware enough to validate your value. Because your worth did not begin at their realization, and it does not disappear in their silence either. There's a point in every man's emotional life where something shifts quietly, and he doesn't even notice it happening at first. It's not when he stops loving, it's when he stops waiting for love to explain itself. And if you've made it this far into what I'm saying, I think part of you is already standing at that edge. Still thinking about them, yes. Still remembering, yes. But something inside you is no longer fully convinced that clarity will come from them. That's important, because the mind can survive heartbreak. It adapts. It reorganizes itself. It builds new routines around absence. But what it struggles with most is unfinished emotional narratives, stories that never got a real ending, just distance and silence. So you keep trying to complete it internally. You replay what you said, what they said, what you wish you had said differently. You imagine alternate versions of reality where timing was better, communication was clearer, ego was softer. That's your brain trying to regain control. Not weakness, control. But here's the part I want you to hear carefully, and not as motivation, not as comfort, but as truth. If someone is truly beginning to understand your worth, it will not look like a perfect emotional awakening. It will look like small moments of realization they don't immediately know what to do with. Regret doesn't always turn into action. Sometimes it turns into awareness first. And awareness is uncomfortable, because it forces people to sit with the version of themselves who didn't recognize something valuable when it was right in front of them. But your healing cannot wait for that process to finish inside them. I need you to understand something very clearly here. Even if they are realizing your worth, even if they are thinking about you more than you know, even if they are comparing every new connection to what you once gave, that still does not automatically mean they are capable of showing up differently now. And that distinction protects you from repeating cycles you already survived once. Because emotional recognition is not the same as emotional readiness. You can miss someone deeply and still not be able to love them properly. You can understand your loss and still not have grown enough to handle what you lost in a healthier way. That's the truth most people don't want to accept. So what do you do with someone you can't stop thinking about? You stop making them the center of your emotional evaluation of yourself. Because right now, every time you measure your worth through their imagined realization, you are outsourcing your identity to someone who is not currently participating in your life. And that keeps you stuck. Not because your feelings are wrong, but because your attention is still emotionally anchored to a chapter that is no longer actively being written together. There is a quiet turning point I've seen in men like you. It happens when you finally separate two things: missing someone and needing them to validate what they meant. One keeps you human, the other keeps you emotionally dependent. And I think you already know which direction you're being asked to move toward. Not coldness, not detachment in the fake "I don't care" way people perform online, but something quieter, something stronger, a return to yourself, where your value is no longer something you hope someone finally recognizes, but something you carry without negotiation. And here's the last truth I'll leave you with. If someone truly realizes your worth, they may think about you for a long time. But if you truly realize your own worth, you stop building your life around whether or not they ever say it out loud. And that is where emotional freedom actually begins.